We move to segment 3 for Wednesday. We continue with the anti-partyism that was the beginnings of the progressive movement. Again, the Australian ballot was the idea of the secret ballot. One of the interesting outcomes of the secret ballot being implemented across the United States was that people who had been bribed to vote in the past no longer voted because they weren't getting paid any longer, and so participation went down from sometimes 70 to 80%, as it was when a lot of people were being bribed to vote and before the secret ballot. And today we're lucky if we get 50% participation, as to be a pretty important election for us to actually get half the eligible voters to get out and vote. The other thing that actually took away a lot of the ability of people to be bribed and for the influence of the parties was the direct primary system, which is actually what the presidential candidates are going through right now, but it also relates to candidates at other levels. But the notion that the people themselves would actually vote for particular candidates within the party before that person was actually put up as the party's nominee in the general election. So this was the opposite of the smoke-filled back room, which is how a lot of candidates were chosen in the past. And, of course, sometimes they did well. They picked Lincoln that way, but they also picked Grant and others in the so-called smoke-filled back room, which, interestingly, seems to have made a reappearance with the potential of a brokered convention for the Republicans coming up in this summer, or this summer it may occur. The common theme, again, however, more power to the people. Another theme was the cult of efficiency, and this was the notion that instead of the government being run for the benefit of those who bribe it, or for just a few people, it should be run for the entire citizenry and consider the citizens almost as customers. It should be non-partisan as much as possible, meaning not just one party running an entire city and running it with a political machine. And it should be run by a group to avoid the all-powerful mayor that had become typical of the political machine. So this is where we get the city council. For instance, Dallas has one. We have a mayor, but in truth the mayor doesn't have a lot more power than the people who are on the council itself, because the council has to vote for certain things and have a majority before they make a decision. The mayor can propose and do a couple of other things, but most of the important stuff the entire group has to vote for. Now, this sounds like it's actually a reversal of the ability to get things done, because if there's just one person, it's the only person who has to make the decision. But in truth, this was again the idea that it would be harder to bribe 12 people than it would be to bribe one. And interestingly, where the question, as you see here on the slide, where was the city council first tried? Although many progressive changes were first seen in Wisconsin, which became known as the laboratory of democracy because it tried a lot of things initially before other places did, or Australia, which we saw was the first place with the secret ballot, the city council was found in a perfect location to try an experiment in government. And of course, if you're going to run an experiment, you want to have a sort of a clean atmosphere in order to try that. It would be difficult to do that in most cities because there would be a pre-existing form of government that would have to be ended, and its connections and its power would have to be removed. So instead, the first time a city council was actually tried was in Galveston, Texas in 1901, because it was a pretty good place to start over. Unfortunately, the hurricane of 1900, one of the most devastating as far as loss of life in the history of the United States, had pretty much wiped out the entire city. So as they rebuilt, they began with changing their city form of government to a city council. It was successful, and the idea spreads across the United States. More progressive reforms. You found these on the federal and the state level. On the federal level, you saw both the 16th and the 17th Amendments, which are part of progressivism. The 16th, the one that we dislike the most now, ratified in 1913, is the income tax. Now, we talked before about how it had been created as a emergency move as early federally as the American Civil War, and it had gone back and forth. Some states had forms of it, but the federal government was allowed to create the income tax because it was proposed during progressivism as a way to punish the robber barons, because at the beginning, only the people who were the very wealthy were actually going to be taxed. But as you're probably familiar with, as time goes by, the rate at which or the income that you have to be taxed ends up going all the way down to the poorest people, and so we all pay income tax today. But it's interesting to think of something that we all dislike, income tax, that was passed with the unanimous almost consent of the American people during Progressivism, but they passed it because they saw it as a way to punish the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the Swifts. The 17th Amendment is a prototypical progressive reform. It is the direct election of senators, and it's passed in 1913. Prior to this time, when senators were elected, they were actually elected by the state legislatures. So the people who govern the states would actually vote for the senators. That amendment, number 17, ended that practice and said directly that the people within each state would actually vote for their own senators, which is what we do today. So we elect them in a very similar way to the way that we elect our congressmen, in a direct form. So again, more power to the people. Now, some reforms that you see at the state and local level, depending upon where you lived and what state and what local area you were in, were these three: the initiative, the referendum, and the recall, and they all fit in line very well with more power directly to the people. The initiative was a way of proposing a law and doing so without having to bribe a congressman or somebody at the state legislature or even locally. And an initiative is the idea that if voters of a certain political area get enough signatures on a petition of people who say they support the idea of a piece of legislation being proposed, that piece of legislation or potential law or action will be put on the ballot and people will then vote on it. One of the places today where you see this a lot is out in California. They call them propositions out there, and you'll see these elsewhere and in some local areas. But it was a way for the average person to get legislation considered without having to bribe somebody in government. The referendum was a similar process with the signatures on a petition. But it was actually to get a law that had already been passed and get it put on the ballot so people could either vote yes, we'll have it, or no, we won't, without having to bribe a governor or a state official or anything like that. And then finally, recall is pretty interesting. You could call it the poor man's impeachment, and this is the idea that before someone's term in office is up or had finished, if the people that they governed or had voted them in were angry enough at that person, they could actually have a recall election. And again, if you get enough signatures on petitions, then the name of that person is put on the ballot, and the vote will either keep them in office or remove them early. We've seen some interesting scenarios with recall in different places. Usually it's for a mayor or a governor or something along those lines. None of these three are actually found in the state of Texas, although you'll find them in some local areas, but Texas doesn't have any of these three as state possibilities. But you will find them in different states and different locales across the United States. Now, I know the term that you see there at the top of the PowerPoint slide sounds a little bit like something that might not exist, and that would be Southern Progressivism, because we've talked about the fact that the South was very much in the throes of the Jim Crow system. But there was change, and there was an attempt to get rid of corruption even in the southern cities as well. Similar goals and reforms that we see in progressivism elsewhere will occur in the South, but there's a slightly different rationale. Instead of saying we need to get rid of big business and the terrible politicians, it's let's clean up the terrible system, including the corruption of the black vote forced upon us by those terrible Yankees. That's the view that Southern progressives had. So along with cleaning up business and government corruption, there was a strong sense amongst white Southern voters that the black franchise was part of the problem. In other words, there was a sense that black voters were easily corrupted and controlled, which wasn't any more true than it was for white voters, but in truth, this is the way the many white Southerners saw it. And this culminated in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896 and the solidification of the Jim Crow system of segregation. But what's interesting is that there was something promoted here that we'll talk about that actually helped the African Americans in the South, and also across the country, and that's black progressivism. We'll get to that on the next slide, but let's take the little side trip to the New South movement. We talked about this in class the other day. Although a step below the explosion of the northern industrial economy, the South emerges from Reconstruction with large-scale industry, banking, and product development centered in Atlanta, and later after Spindletop, or after oil is found in the United States, in Dallas. All right, black progressive movement. This is interesting because really black progressivism centers all around the idea of how should African Americans respond to the Jim Crow system. And as we'll see in a lot of the social movements that we'll look at from this point forward, and definitely within the African American community, there's often two schools of thought that will arise to deal with any kind of big issue that the entire community is facing. And in this one, there were two major camps as to how to deal with Jim Crow. The camp that followed Booker T. Washington and the camp that followed W.E.B. Du Bois and his views on how African Americans should respond. Here's your comparison. Booker T. Washington, the first president of the Tuskegee Institute, spokesman for African Americans from 1890 to his death in 1915. Du Bois, first African American to receive a PhD from an American university, went to Harvard in 1895. And so these two men have two very different views. The short version is that Washington's view on this was that African Americans should fight the Jim Crow system, but they should do it as an individual by pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps and making themselves the best they can be. His argument was that if you tried to work as a group, you would draw a lot of negative attention towards you, and it would actually be counterproductive. He put this idea forward in a speech that he gave in 1895 that people have called the Atlanta Compromise. He said, cast down your bucket where you are, and if you'll work through your own individual effort, and each African American does this, then the entire community will raise itself up as the water raises all ships or raises all boats. So the idea being, work as an individual, don't cause a lot of trouble, just make yourself the best you can be, and ultimately that will help to change the Jim Crow system. Du Bois, on the other hand, was the side of the equation that wanted to be a little bit more controversial, and will be seen as much more controversial, and believed that change would need to come by working as a group. That's really his view. When he read about the Atlanta Compromise, he called Booker T. Washington an Uncle Tom, which is an epithet that's used within the African American community to call somebody a sellout. He believed that group effort was the path to equality. Now, of course, this is something that is risky because working as a group, especially in the Deep South, would risk the potential of being attacked by the Anglo majority and cause more fear within the Anglo community, but Du Bois believed that a group was necessary to make any kind of a change. Now, he joined eventually with white progressives and founded a group dedicated to creating equality by using the law, and that's a key idea, called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or as you know them perhaps today, the NAACP. They formed in 1909, and so Du Bois was a bit more controversial, a bit more confrontational, but he wasn't exactly a rebel in the sense of being some sort of revolutionary, as we'll see later, but he did believe in working as a group, and he did believe working within the law. And in fact, the truth is that the NAACP will be behind the biggest change that we'll see, although it doesn't occur until 1954. They will actually have one of their lead attorneys, Thurgood Marshall, argue the Brown versus Board of Education decision at that point. One criticism of Du Bois was that he himself was an elitist, and he wrote many times and spoke of how most African Americans were not smart enough to really be part of the movement or to make any kind of real change. He said only about 1/10 of the African American community had the capacity to do that. He called them the talented 10th, and so of course he's been criticized for his elitism. The other major movement, and we can't leave this one out, of course, because it has a huge impact on American history, and of course I want to make sure that I get out of the parking lot alive today, is women's progressivism. And this is the push for women's equality that, of course, will end up in two major events: prohibition and the women's rights to vote, which will occur as constitutional amendments that will be passed just after World War I, and we'll pick up with that story when we begin in class on Wednesday.